And welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be going over a game that was played between the former world chess champion Vachier-Lagrave and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in the Norway chess event being held in Stavanger. Now, before we jump into the game, just to set the backdrop, Vachier-Lagrave has been a player who has not played much since COVID times. He played in Croatia last year, had a pretty good result, including a couple of victories against Garry Kasparov. However, his recent return was in the Poland Super Bet event, where we did cover some of his games. And in that event, he crushed the rapid portion of the event. Unfortunately, in the blitz portion, he came up a little bit short, finished a half point out of first place, but nonetheless, it was a very stellar performance. Now, in the Norway blitz, which was held before this event to determine the spots and the qualification and the pairings as well, Vichy had a very good result, scoring 5 points out of 9, including a win against the world champion Magnus Carlsen. However, many people have said, including about myself, that rapid and blitz is very different than classical chess. So with Vichy having not played classical chess in so long, many were wondering how he would fare. So in his first round game, he starts with the white pieces against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Vichy starts with his classic e4. We get c5, knight to f3, Maxime plays d6, nothing new here, obviously inviting Vichy to play d4 and go into the Najdorf variation of the open Sicilian. Vichy, however, says no, and he chooses to play bishop b5, playing the canal variation. So we get bishop d7, trade, queen d7, and now Vichy plays c4, which is known as the Sokolsky variation of the canal attack here. He plays c4 and e4. The idea is to play it like a Maroczy bind setup, where white will control these central squares, specifically d5 in particular, with both the pawns on e4 and c4. So we get knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, d4 played by Vichy. Of course, he does not castle here, because after castles knight to d4, black would be able to prevent white from playing d4 and getting this Maroczy bind setup with the pawns on c4 and e4 covering this d5 square. So instead of castling, Vichy plays d4, pawn takes knight takes as played. We get g6, f3, bishop g7, bishop e3 to support this knight on d4. If white were to castle, for example, black would be able to play this move knight takes e4. And if you recapture the knight, you lose your knight on d4. And if you take the knight on c6 after knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, pawn takes knight, black is simply up one pawn here and doing very, very well. So instead, Vichy plays bishop e3 to reinforce the knight on d4. Castles is played, castles, and now we get a6 by Maxime. Knight b3 played here by Vichy. A little bit of an unusual move and perhaps a surprise. Normally in these sorts of positions with this Maroczy bind setup, white will generally go knight de2 with ideas like b3 to support the pawn on c4, or perhaps white will even play moves like queen e2, rook d1, rook c1, and knight d5, just leaving the knight on d4 in the center. However, Vichy chooses to play knight b3. Now, the reason this is a little bit unusual is because, as I alluded to earlier, normally black wants to put pressure on this pawn on c4. So, for example, after knight d2, knight e5, b3, white has this nice pawn chain from a2 to c4 here. And after knight b3, you now can no longer guard the pawn, because after knight e5, you can't push the pawn to b3 since the knight is in the way. However, in this situation, if black were to play knight e5 after queen e2, rook a c8, white can now play knight bd2 here, followed by b3 later on, and white is a little bit better. Additionally, white might have the alternative to play pawn to c5 here, where both the knight and the bishop are protecting the pawn. So knight b3 is a very unusual move, but the computers seem to think it's fine, and Vichy chooses to play it. So now we get e6 played by Maxime, and black really has two ideas here. Because white has this Maroczy bind setup, very specifically, the pawns on c4 and e4 here preventing d5, black generally tries to play either b5 and make a pawn break on the queen side, or a pawn to d5 and break in the center here. Now again, trying to play d5 is very difficult because white has two pawns, a knight, and a queen guarding this d5 square, so it's four pieces that are covering it, and so generally it's very hard to play for that, whereas b5 is perhaps a little bit easier. You can go like rook b8 and b5 in one go. So now Vichy plays queen to e2, queen to e7 is played here, rook f d1, rook f d8. Both sides get the queen out of the line of fire on the d file here. We get rook a c1, rook a c8, and now Vichy plays knight d4, which is a very unusual move for a couple of reasons. First of all, in the game of chess, generally when we approach games, the idea is you want to play moves that are logical. There needs to be a plan behind it. So as Vichy having played knight b3 earlier, if we go all the way back here, and then going back to d4 a couple moves later, you feel like white has lost the tempo. So for humans, generally, it's very difficult to play moves like this, where you just admit that maybe you did something wrong, or maybe in fact, it doesn't really matter at all, even though there is no plan behind the move. So after knight d4 is played, Maxime plays this move knight to d7, logical move, opening up this long diagonal. b3 played by Vichy to reinforce his pawn on c4. Now he has a connect 3 from a2 to c4. And now we get b5 played here by Maxime, which is a very committal move. Now, one of the knocks on Maxime throughout his career as a professional chess player has been that in certain situations, when the game is not clear and there are not straightforward ideas, sometimes he's not able to show patience, and he immediately needs to look for counterplay by going for sacrifices. So by playing this b5 move, it's very, very committal. The computer does not like it at all, and it creates some weaknesses. A better move here probably would have been to play something like knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then either a move like knight to e5 or even a move like queen to g5 here. And white is a little bit better, but the game goes on. However, Maxime felt the need to lash out right away and try to create that instant counterplay with b5, which turns out to be a mistake. So we got pawn takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes, rook takes, pawn takes pawn. And now Vichy plays queen d2. Very good move. He does not grab the pawn on b5 with the knight because that would hang a rook on c1. And if you take with the queen on b5 here, after this move d5, pawn takes pawn, knight f6. Black actually is getting a lot of counterplay here. This pin on the c file is very nasty. Black can maybe take on d5 with e pawn and go for a queen e3 check. Additionally, there's also ideas like knight d5, and all of white's pieces here are very iffy. Additionally, there are ideas like queen a7 or even queen c5 to play on the diagonal from a7 to g1. So there is potentially some counterplay here. Now, the computer says that after rook d1, white is still quite a bit better, but it's a very difficult move to play, and it doesn't feel natural to me, and I expect even for someone like Vichy, it would not have felt like a natural reply. So here Vichy plays queen e2, logical move, guards the rook on c1. Now he's threatening to take the pawn on d6 and the pawn on b5 with the knight as well. So rook b8 is played here by Maxime to guard one of the two pawns, and now Vichy snaps d6. Maxime plays b4, Vichy goes knight to e2, and now knight e5 is played here. Now, on first glance, this looks quite scary and menacing because if you were to trade the rooks on d8, for example here, let's say you play a move like queen c2. After queen a7 check, if you play this move queen c5, you run into a nasty tactic with rook d1 check. And if you take the rook, queen takes c5 is winning for black. If you go king f2 here, black is knight d3, creating a very nasty fork, which would win the queen. So you can't really block with the queen. If you go king h1 after knight d3, your rook is under attack, but there also are some very nice ideas with knight f2. For example, say you play a move like rook to b1, black can play knight f2. And I guess after king g1, you don't really have a smothered checkmate idea here. But after something like takes, king h1, knight f2, king g1, rook to... Maybe it's not a rook, maybe just queen e3 is simplest. Black probably should be winning here, and white doesn't really have a whole lot going on. So it looks very scary, but Vichy, to his credit, he does some good calculations here, looks at the position, sees a very concrete way to play and reach an endgame, and he doesn't see the boogeyman. So Vichy plays rook d1, knight c6 played here by Maxime. Now here, if black were to play queen a7 check, for example, you can just go king f1, and you're still controlling the d file with the triple stack, and this should be winning. So instead, we get knight c6 played here by Maxime. Vichy plays e5, a fantastic move here, reinforcing the rook on d6. Black cannot take the pawn because then you would lose the trade on d8, and white simply has an extra rook. And now if you take on d6, I can take with either the pawn or the queen, and it's very, very strong for white. So queen a7 is played. We get king h1, queen to f2 played by Maxime. Trying very hard to create some counterplay here, maybe back rank checkmate ideas like queen f1, maybe something with its pin towards d2, but really trying desperately to create counterplay because in the long term, white is simply up a pawn here. So rook c1 is played by Vichy, another perfect move. Rook takes rook. Black does not have a choice here. If you say move the knight, again, you lose the trade on d8. If you move the rook over, I can just take because after queen f1 check, I have knight g1, stopping the back rank checkmate, and white is simply up an extra piece. So here, rook takes d6 is forced. Pawn takes played by Vichy, creating the passed pawn. Knight e5 here. h3 played by Vichy, creating the luft for the king here, so there are no back rank checkmates. And now we get rook to b5, played by Maxime. Knight f3 is another move that black can try to play here, but it doesn't quite work after pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn here. White can simply go king to g1, and there's no perpetual or repetition here. The king is very safe with the knight covering the g3 square. So instead, rook b5 is played by Maxime. We get f4 here, knight to d7, and now the great move, queen to d4 by Vichy, offering black the opportunity to capture the knight on e2. But after queen e2, rook c8, knight f8, white can take and play queen h8, which is a very nasty checkmate here. So instead, Maxime has to trade the queens on d4, but after knight d4, rook d5, knight c6, rook d6, knight b4, you'll notice that white is still up a pawn, but most importantly for an endgame, white has two connected pawns on a2 and b3 that can run up the board. So now we get the move e5 played by Maxime, pawn takes, knight takes, and now rook c5 played by Vichy. Very nice move, attacking the knight on e5. Additionally, black has a choice to make. If you go knight d3, for example, after knight takes rook b5, followed by a4, a5, b4, white should be cleanly winning this rook and pawn endgame. If you play a move like knight to d7, white can probably play a move like rook d5, and again, with the two connected, should be a pretty straightforward win for white. So here, so rook d1 is played, king h2, now f6 to reinforce the knight, but after f6, a4 is played by Vichy, rook to b1 is played, and now rook to c3. Another great move, guarding the pawn on b3, threatening to push this a pawn further up the board. And this is basically lost at this point. So we get rook a1 here by Maxime, and now Vichy plays rook c7, highlighting why rook c5 was such a great move before, because now the king is cut off on the back rank. It can never come up to the 7th rank or the 6th rank and join the game. Additionally, after a move like rook b1 here, white has many ways to win, but probably the easiest one to play is something like knight d5, rook takes b3, knight f6. If black goes king h8, there's a classic Arabian checkmate here with the knight and the rook. And if black goes king f8, you can just take, check, and then go knight d7. And after the knights come off, white is simply up 2 pawns here in a very cleanly winning rook and pawn endgame. So after this move, rook c7, played by Vichy here, Maxime resigns the game. And with that, Vichy wins his first game in Norway chess. He wins his first game of classical chess in several years. And he proves all the doubters wrong in that there really is no difference at the end of the day between classical chess, rapid chess, and blitz chess. It is still just chess. Anyway, you guys, I hope you enjoyed the recap of this Anand game from round 1 of Norway chess. I'll try to do more recaps in the near future. But at any rate, I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you've not already. And thank you for all the love and support to all the great YouTube fans out there.